Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Julia Hinka, and I am the Nature Store Clerk for the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. As you probably already know, we are a 501c3 nonprofit established in 1997 to support Ohio's only national wildlife refuge complex with youth development, public use projects, and most recently, land acquisition and restoration. We are located along the southern shore of Lake Erie near Oak Harbor in some of the most critical wetland habitats in the world. If you're interested in learning more about us and what we do, I will drop a link in the chat in just a moment, and that link will point you in the right direction to become a member, make a tax-deductible donation to support our work, or to shop our online nature store. Today we are joined with John Watts, and he has so graciously joined us today to share his program on the birds of Hocking County. Before we begin, I'm just going to ask that everyone stays muted. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will ask those at the end of the presentation. So John, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Julie. Thanks for joining our talk this morning. This is one of the first one of these I've done, so this is, you're all the guinea pigs on this. So we're going to talk about, while all the action this weekend is up where Julie's at Northwest Ohio and up in that area with migration, we're going to go down to the southeastern part of Ohio, about 40 miles southeast of Columbus, and talk a little bit about the birds of Hocking County and how kind of the history of the county, from a bird standpoint and what's here. I'd like to recognize the other two co-authors of the publication, Paul Knoop and Gary Covert. We started on this back about 2006-07 and worked on putting this publication together. I'll make a shameless plug for the publications available through Amazon or through McDonald Woodward Publishing if you're interested in acquiring it. So with that, I'll go ahead and start. I'm retired from the Columbus and Franklin County Metro Parks. I was a resource manager. I worked there for over 33 years, oversaw the restoration of about 5,000 acres of restoration in central Ohio of wetlands, prairies, and forests, and was in charge of managing the almost 20 acres of natural areas and parks in central Ohio. I want to point out this little picture over here of a Buick's wren, and we'll come back to that later, but that photograph was taken in 1923 in northern Hocking County. And, you know, we'll talk more about that as we go along. When we started looking at this project of doing something, it had really been nothing done on specifically any real things on birds in southeastern Ohio. There have been a lot of things done around the state and overall. We looked at Hocking County. This is an aerial of Clear Creek Metro Park in northern Hocking County. It's 5,300 acres in size. 4,760 acres are dedicated as Ohio's largest nature preserve. And almost everything you see in this photograph is part of the Metro Park. And so, interestingly enough, you see a tremendous amount of forested area, wonderful topography. But Hocking County has a lot of these areas that are highly forested with a wonderful bird population. Many people are aware of the scenery. Rockbridge State Nature Preserve, the longest natural land bridge in the state. The Old Man's Cave hosts several million visitors a year. But this part of this entire part of southeastern Ohio has not only great birds, but tremendous public access in terms of Hocking State Forest, state nature preserves, state parks, the part of the Wayne National Forest, Tar Hollow State Forest. And so we see these wonderful areas that host wonderful natural areas, as well as a lot of other natural history. We'll talk some today about the hemlock forests, which are one of the real specialty areas of southeast Ohio, and particularly in Hocking County, with some of these eastern hemlocks approaching, and even in some cases over 4 feet across in diameter. For just some reference today, this is Franklin County, Columbus, Ohio. We're down in this part of southeastern Ohio. If you look at this glacial boundary map over here on the right, you can see the glacial boundary just hugs kind of the northeastern portion of Hocking County with some of the Illinois until and outwash. But with this glacial boundary being located where it's at, we certainly at one point in time, thousands of years ago, saw the influence of that cooler temperature. As you can see, Hocking County is in the mixed oak forest region, but has a number of other smaller components of Ohio's forest system. And this forest, along with its location on the boundary of the glaciers, brings not only southern species, but a few of these northern species. We see this in 2 or 3 locations in Ohio. We see it up here in the Mohican area. If you're familiar with Mohican forest and some of the breeding birds there, we see a few of the same things in this part. And again, you find some of this up in the northeastern part of the state. I just briefly want to touch on the diversity of the county as a whole. Gary and Holly Couvert, who are taxonomists, have been doing an all-taxa biota survey at Crane Hollow, which is a private nature preserve of about 2,000 acres in central Hocking County. They started this about 20 years ago. And I'd just like to point to down here in the bottom, they have documented over 11,400 species of plants, animals, fungi there. This is more than has been documented in the Great Smoky Mountains, which we hold in high esteem as one of our most diverse areas in eastern United States. I just want to show that because this really shows the diversity of this portion of Ohio in terms of all the things that are there. Their species list at the time for birds is 149 species. I've been doing bird surveys down there for 8 years. And in that time, we've added a number of things to the list. A little bit of the history of the county as we look at what these original forests prior at the time of settlement looked like in southeastern Ohio. These 2 photos were taken down in the southeastern portion of the state, and I think are very reflective of what Hocking County looked like probably at the time of settlement. The picture on the left, the 3 largest trees there in the foreground that we see are white oaks. And while we don't know their exact size, we can presume that the gentlemen standing in those photos are about 5'10". It gives you an idea of just how large and massive these original trees in the forests were. The photos on the right show tulip trees. From that time, we move into a time in our history where Hocking County looked a little bit different. And we owe a lot of knowing a little bit about this to Ed Thomas. Ed Thomas was the curator of natural history for what is now the Ohio Historical, or the Ohio History Connection, the Ohio Historical Society. He was a tremendous field naturalist, was very tied into research with researchers at Ohio State. He wrote more than 2,000 articles for the Columbus Dispatch over a 50-year period of time, talking about field trips and natural history and species. But this is an excerpt out of one of his, and I think it's interesting how he notes in the bottom that bird study is open to rich and poor, young and old, and is fascinating to the person who merely desires pleasure and relaxation, as well as the painstaking investigator. Was really a very interesting individual. He was mostly known, his specialty was insects, crickets and grasshoppers, and he could identify all of them by sound like we do birds. He bought a piece of property in Hocking County in 1923, and this was a group from Columbus. It was a naturalist group known as the Wheaton Club. They're still in existence today. This individual right here in the middle is probably one of the more famous members of that early group. That's Milt Troutman, who did a number of bird surveys, was known for his publications on the fishes of Ohio, certainly one of Ohio's premier historical naturalists. This is Ed Thomas. But the area that he bought was 86 acres in the Clear Creek Valley of northern Hocking County. This is a photo out of a photo journal of Ed Thomas's from 1924. This valley is Neotoma Valley. This is a photo that I recreated in March of 2015. You can still see the match up the ridge lines, but it does give you an idea of how denuded Hocking County was after the deforestation and logging of those original forests, but how much it has come back within that basically 90-year period of time. This is the cabin that was his cabin of Neotoma Valley. You know, the cabin is still there today. You can visit that cabin as part of Clear Creek Metro Park. This large rock is still exactly where it was then, but you can see how open this landscape was during that time. Again, here's what here's what it kind of looks like today. The arrow over here on the right, if you look closely, you see a little pink dot. That's my wife sitting on the porch of the cabin. And this is the location of the cabin and the rock. And you can see how much visually this area has changed. So we've seen that complete change of original forest and now into very nicely established second growth forest. As we started looking at the birds of Hocking County, with Ed Thomas starting a breeding bird survey in that valley in 1923 through 1940, we quickly kind of looked at the idea that we had some type of bird survey that took place in Hocking County every decade since 1923. I won't read through all of these. You can look at them, but you know, really became kind of a nice story that we thought we could tell here. In amongst the other breeding bird surveys of one type or another, there have been 3 Christmas bird counts that included Hocking County. The first one was what was known as the Sugar Grove count, which is actually Sugar Grove's located in very southern Fairfield County, but the count circle included most of what is now Clear Creek Metro Park and the bottoms along the Hocking River in northern Hocking County. Ed Thomas was in fact the compiler of this from 1944 to 1954. Beginning in the mid-70s, a group of birders ran a Logan Christmas bird count in the central and southern part of the county, which included a little bit of northern Athens County, from 1973 to 1987. And then starting in 2005, the Hocking Hills Christmas bird count was established in central Hocking County using Gibesonville as the count circle. So we really have, even from a wintering standpoint, we begin to have very, very nice coverage of Hocking County. When we published our book back in 2016, we had 266 species of birds that we could find documented records of for the county. This is a largely forested county. We'll talk about a couple of places that has one state park lake of size in it, has a few ponds, a few quarries, but kind of felt that that was really a very significant number given our location kind of in the southeastern part of the state, not necessarily along any major flyways. 137 species have been documented as breeding in the county. So those records date back to the 20s and to a publication that Lawrence Hicks did in 1935 on the breeding birds of unglaciated Ohio. 31 species of waterfowl. It's interesting to note we have one published record of a snowy owl from 1954 that has been found. I note 6 winter records of warbler species. The only one there that I kind of point to, the black and white warbler was probably a very early migrant versus more than a winter resident. But we'll come back to one of those records towards the end of our talk today. And, you know, the interesting part, we see these things that are now extinct, passenger pigeon bones discovered at Ash Cave in 1928 by Robert Goslin, who was a local archaeologist that did a lot of work in central and southeastern Ohio. This is fairly common for that we see in this part of the state in these archaeological digs. You know, you can't really kind of make this up. Our first bird record from Hocking County dates back to the late 1700s, and you know, we end up with something like Carolina parakeets, which are now extinct. But this was published as part of a master's, I believe, by Daniel McKinley in the late 70s in the Ohio Journal of Science, referencing the travels of Reverend David Jones, who traveled southern and eastern Ohio as a missionary back during the late 1700s, and referencing where they feel this flock of Carolina parakeets were seen in the vicinity of Salt Creek in southwestern Hocking County, which is near Laurelville, if you are familiar with where that's at, in the very, very southwestern portion of the county. So a very nice historical perspective. You know, as you begin researching these records, it's amazing what you find. We had help from a number of people that were able to help us look for some things as well. Bachman sparrow, another species gone largely from Ohio, that was last kind of seen on a wide basis. There was a bird in 1974 in southern Delaware County. These are 11 specimens that were actually collected in what is now Clear Creek Metro Park by some of the people there with Ed Thomas and the university from 1929 to 1936. This bird was last reported in 1966 in that part of the county. Buick's wrens, you know, we think of the eastern population as almost gone. In fact, today, they nested in the Clear Creek Valley, and Lawrence Hicks regarded them as a reasonably common species in southern and southeastern Ohio in the 30s, having them kind of about as common as blue jays in some fact in that area. But here's a specimen, once again, from Clear Creek Valley, 1936. And these were all at the museum at Ohio State. Some other, I think, interesting records, a record of a golden eagle by Dr. Wheaton that appeared in his bird report of 1882. This was only the second bird of Ohio report ever completed, which he references this report. The other one that I thought was interesting, the county's first bald eagle record comes from the late 1800s. And I think in this entire quote here on Oliver Davey, a noted ornithologist here in central Ohio, it was one among a number of bald eagle and golden record eagles that he received between 1878 and 1881. So interesting that I just think that's an interesting quote among a number of those. The first pair of eagles nested successfully in Hocking County in 2011, just north of Logan on a very nice swamp that's owned by Capital University along the Hocking River. And they have nested there successfully every year since. So, you know, I've been birding long enough that I remember when there were two nests of birds, both near Ottawa in the 1980s. And to see these now regularly throughout the state, I think does note that we've done a number of things successfully. While we hear about, you know, how many things are going wrong in the world with conservation and birds populations, I think it is good to note that, you know, we do see some of these things that are successful. Since 1937, about 12 species of birds we can really look at that have either declined dramatically or disappeared from Hocking County. Just, you know, we were talking about a little bit, but as you saw those original photos from the 20s, you get an idea of how much the landscape has really changed in Hocking County during that time. A few of these species that have disappeared, loggerhead shrike, upland sandpiper, larch sparrow, were never terribly common in Hocking County, but we're certainly there. Numbers in decline. The ruffed grouse have declined dramatically during our that time period, and even from the 1980s to present, the most recent breeding bird atlas showed that they've declined. The Vesper sparrow, I have an arrow on it down here. This is a species that's very difficult to see in the county because of all the forests and the valleys. There is some farmland in southwestern part of the county, and just across the county line at Laurelville, as you get into Pickaway County, Vesper sparrows become fairly common. So this is one that I put in that area because it's not very, very common. It's probably declined quite a bit as that farmland's reverted, but there are some very good populations just within a few miles of the county line. The good news is here's a number of 24 species have increased. Some of these, mute swan, we don't necessarily like to hear that, but other species in here are very, very desirable species. Probably of note, you notice right away, species such as winter wren, veery, hermit thrush, blue-headed vireo, magnolia warbler, Canada warbler, all species that moved in as the hemlock forests became very, very well established throughout central part of the county. The one species in here that we'll point out real quick, the Mississippi kite, the first breeding record in Ohio was discovered in Hocking County in 2007. This is near Logan, right off of the Hocking River Valley. Birds nested successfully there for at least 2 years. Since that time, they've nested at 2 or 3 other locations in the county. I don't know that I would call them an annual breeder, but certainly very regular. We've had last year, this species nested near Cedar Falls in 2019 and 20 in the same location and successfully raised young. So hopefully within the next few weeks, we ought to see if these return, as they return generally mid to late May by the time they get here. We'll talk a little bit about migration, and we'll kind of start early and go through a few things, and we'll get into a few of the breeding birds. Lake Logan is one of our best migratory stops for waterfowl. It's the largest body of water in Hocking County. That's 400 acres in size approximately. And it's oriented north and south and parallels the Hocking River. And I think this is really important. As we all know, birds migrate major water courses and waterways. The Hocking River Valley is a distinct feature of this part of the state. And Lake Logan must look like a tremendous sky pond to them as birds and waterfowl are moving north. But you don't think too much about, Southeast Ohio, one lake in the middle of Hocking County holding large numbers of ducks. But duck migration for Lake Logan can be very, very impressive. We've seen 31 species of ducks in the county. This year alone, I've seen 25 species of waterfowl on Lake Logan, including, we'll talk about one here in a second that was kind of a nice rarity for us. But sometimes when the lake opens up just a little bit earlier than the areas north of Columbus, as birds are migrating north, if that ice stays on in central and northern Ohio, on these lakes in the southern part of the state and along even the lower part of the Cider River, we see really, really nice staging of particularly the divers as they move through. This was a very nice group of redheads in 2018. Just this past winter, a couple of months ago, we had you can see the ice is still on Lake Logan, but these leads open up. And all the bright white spots you see there are canvasbacks. There were 55 canvasbacks there in one group, which for our part of the state is a fairly significant observation. You get into other areas, you may see hundreds or even thousands in the Sandusky Bay as they move through, but a very significant bird for us. We also see some of the rarer divers. This old squaw was only our long-tailed duck was only our 3rd county record this past winter. It stayed around for about 10 days, which is unusual. Usually when these things turn up down here for us, they stay a couple of days and move on. And then we regularly get greater scaup on Lake Logan as well. Not annually, but certainly every other year or so, we see greater scaup moving through, generally in very small numbers of 1s and 2s. The other thing that can be impressive for Lake Logan, because it's that long lake, it's oriented north and south. In some years, we see very, very nice flights of species such as common mergansers, common loons. The flight of 2019, I counted over 250 common mergansers on Lake Logan at one time. They stayed for a few days as things opened to the north. they abruptly left and you're down to usually you see like 3 or 6 or something like that in a group. We see loons every spring in March and April, and then again in November as they come back through in the fall. But the photo here at the bottom, while not the crispest and a nice crisp photo, does show a few of the 54 that staged at Lake Logan during late March of 2018. There again before they headed north. But these are really, really fascinating movements when we see them come through kind of our part of the state, something we will not see on an annual basis. We get nice groups of the dabbling ducks that come through as well. Pintails usually come through in very low numbers. The most I think I've ever seen at one time has been around 20 on one occasion. Usually you see them in 1s and 2s. Other things kind of trickle through here, much as you would expect to see throughout the other parts of Ohio. A few of our other rarities that we see here that you wouldn't, you kind of think in Southeast Ohio. American pelicans we've seen on a number of occasions, generally very small numbers. November of 19, this red-throated loon stayed on Lake Logan for about 2 weeks, which the other 2 records, they were kind of 1 and 2 day records and left. Any shorebird that we get down here is fairly significant. We see solitary sandpipers, spotted sandpipers, a few things like that. But anytime we get a group of anything that's fairly significant, usually going to be probably at the beach at Lake Logan State Park. As we were putting our book together, Paul Knoop told me he knew of a gentleman in Logan, Ohio, that had a photograph of a white ibis on Lake Logan. And I kind of looked at him and raised an eyebrow and said, yeah, that's, yeah, sure, a white ibis. And he said, well, I think you should call him up. So I called him. He was a photographer, not really a bird watcher. And I said, I understand you have this photo of a white ibis. Can you describe that bird to me? And he said, well, it's a white bird with black wingtips and a long down-curved orange beak. And I said, well, you just eliminated an awful lot of birds. And this was only the 5th spring record of a white ibis in Ohio. And at the time of our publication, I think there were only 13 accepted records of white ibis in Ohio. So we do see some very unusual things, but a lot of these are one-day wonders. We get a number of wading birds. Little blue heron have been seen there at Lake Logan on more than one occasion. And then we have also had snowy egrets on 2 occasions there. So if you're coming birding to Hocking County, I always recommend people try to get there early in the morning before there's very much activity around the lake. Early spring, before the fishermen get out, the ducks are very, very good. And then there are a number of other things that you might see. For our kind of more of our passerines and our land birds that come through, a lot of the things here come through in very small windows. They don't stage down here like you might see, like people are experiencing this weekend up at Lake Erie, along the south shore of Lake Erie. We have smaller windows in which a number of the same species come through, usually in much smaller numbers. But usually along somewhere in March, we do get movements of rusty blackbirds coming through. Some of the best areas here are the old abandoned canals, which are now these almost shallow forested vernal pools and swamp forests in a way. And it does give you an opportunity to actually not just observe the bird, but see them in their habits of what they do. This one over here was flipping this leaf, looking for insects and invertebrates to eat, which is their main way of hunting. Wilson snipe, and they're again a bird that probably goes overlooked in the county. Not a lot of records, but they pass through annually, but just something that goes very, very overlooked. And then in mid-March through the early April, the movement through the fox sparrows along the brushy woodland edges and other forested areas is something that you'll wake up some days and hear some of them singing on certain nice sunny crisp mornings. So we do see a lot of these things moving through. I want to talk a little bit about some of the breeding birds of the county. The hemlock forest nesting areas are some of our real specialty species nest. This is, I think, part of what adds, I'll use the word, a little bit of glamour to Hocking County, are these hemlock forests, these cool ravines, big box canyons like you see at Conkle's Hollow, Old Man's Cave, surrounded by these hemlocks. It gives you a cooler habitat. You go there in the middle of the summer, these areas, a little higher humidity, nice and cool. And so we get some of these northern forest affinities that breed regularly in Hocking County. Magnolia warbler is one of those. You know, I would say that almost any reasonable patch of hemlocks probably has a pair or two of magnolia warblers in them. They were first, we were able to first confirm them with this fledgling at Clear Creek back in 2000. If you bird Clear Creek Metro Park, I recommend walking the lower section of the Hemlock Trail. That's where this photograph was taken. There's usually a pair of magnolia warblers in there. Canada warblers have nested there right along the trail, usually 10 to 12 species of warblers, plus hermit thrushes and barred owls and other things nest there. But this clear, you know, you can see the humidity in the background here. This is very, very typical of what we see in through Hocking County on these gorges and waterfalls. Winter wrens are kind of a very rare nester here, but they do seem to kind of come and go in groups. The last ones that I'm aware of were at Clear Creek Metro Park in 2017. Nina Harfman, local photographer, was able to capture this picture. This is the nest that it was building in the background of a fallen stump. About 50 yards away, another male was singing. So we don't know if this was a dummy nest, if it made it or not, but there have been a number of other records since 2000 of them nesting every few years. They've nested in Conkle's Hollow historically and other areas in the central part. So nice when you can find these. They commonly winter down here in southern Ohio, as they do a lot of other places, but these little brushy hillsides or forested hillsides with little brush piles are excellent places to find them in the winter. The other four members, I think, of the Hemlock Forest Association that we say are really specifically hemlock nesters are these four species: black-throated green, hermit thrush, Canada warbler, and the blue-headed vireo. Of these, it seems like the blue-headed vireo is the distribution of it with the distribution of Eastern Hemlock is almost the exact same map in the state of Ohio. Black-throated greens, if you go farther north, you tend to find them in deciduous forests with mixed hemlocks, mixed evergreens in. But for Southeast Ohio, they're primarily in these just hemlock forests. I'm told they even nest in some of the mixed forests of Northeastern Ohio. Hermit thrushes at one point seemed to be a fairly uncommon species, and it started showing up in the mid-90s throughout Hocking County. And now they're very common in a number of these state park areas, Clear Creek Metro Park. You know, if you take a walk even before dark in the evening around these areas, it's all you hear are hermit thrushes singing. In Canada warblers, there's probably a population of 6 to 12 pair of Canada warblers that nest annually within Hocking County. Again, Conkle's Hollow is one place that's fairly accessible to the public where these nest, but probably of this group here, clearly the rarest of them and the winter wren. The hemlock woolly adelgid, however, does pose a real problem. And as birders, we like to sit here and we look at what would be impacted from a bird standpoint. And, you know, I think it's 6 species that we can say really nest in these hemlock associations that may not nest in other places. But I think that what we have to look at is what are the impacts ecologically to losing a significant portion of our hemlocks to this bug. It's kind of an aphid-like insect. It's been around a long time. It has done a fair amount of damage in the Smoky Mountains and has moved into Ohio within the last 10 years or so. There are a number of treatments. There are some chemical treatments being done where they're actually injecting trees. They're not really broadcasting it aerially. But I know they're also looking at some biological controls as well. But if we lose these hemlocks, you kind of think about that picture that I showed that had the big hemlock forest. Generally, there's not a lot of forest cover on the ground or herbaceous layers underneath of these hemlocks because of the lack of sunlight. If these forests become exposed to sunlight, heavy impacts of rain on these very sandy soils, very sloping topography, it's likely that we would see some erosion, which could then impact some of the adjacent streams and ravines. We would see changes to that structure of our forest floor. So what would that do for birding species? And then what would we see from the aspect of invasion of invasive species? We're already seeing stilt grass has become kind of one of the main invaders of the forest floor here. But I think what we would see is probably some of the other shrubs that might come in as that light is opened up, and could have a larger ecological impact beyond just the birds. Some of our common forest nesting species in Hocking County, I kind of picked the four that I kind of think are some of our most common outside of things like chickadees and red-bellied woodpeckers and tufted titmice. So it's certainly high on our list. But red-eyed vireo, Acadian flycatchers are just returning here within the last week or so. You find them along all the stream valleys, the hemlock ravines, just really a very observable bird. They're very tame as you kind of walk past them and under them. Wood thrushes are very common throughout parts of the county. I do a survey at Crane Hollow on about 30 acres. It's not unusual for me to be in terms of double digits singing birds on that 40-acre tract during our breeding bird surveys. Ovenbird is probably of our nesting warblers, one of the more common species. It's very well scattered throughout the county on a number of slopes, and usually is just very widely scattered. Hooded warblers are probably a nice addition up on the ridge tops, but they usually don't come down into the valleys. A few other species that we commonly see in the county, kind of scattered in maybe fewer numbers than the first ones I showed you, but certainly very regularly encountered. Scarlet tanager, eastern wood peewees, which have just returned here, and then great crested flycatchers. I was at the location of this photograph just yesterday, and the great crested, this is the third year they've returned to that same exact cavity. So they were flying and already starting to set up their territory and calling. So really nice array of forest birds. I want to share the warblers because we all like warblers. It's a huge topic with migration, but if in Hocking County, if you want a really opportunity to learn songs and really learn them, over 20 species of warblers nest in Hocking County on an annual basis. And it really gives you an opportunity to observe them and to hear them for more than just a week or two during the year as they pass through in the spring. All of these that you see here are fairly common throughout the county. As you go into some of the brushier area or edgerow areas, prairie warblers have become I think much more common over the last 25 years than they were, being found in a variety of habitats. Blue-wing warblers kind of tend to move around a little bit based on if the successional stage of the habitat's maintained. Yellow warblers are very common around any bodies of water or scrubby fields, but if you go to Lake Logan, you'll get your share of yellow warblers. And then pine warblers, usually associated with pine plantings that have deciduous trees mixed in with them. So if you find areas of pitch pines or shortleaf pine with deciduous trees mixed in, you almost always can encounter a pine warbler in that setting. Other forested species, American redstarts have become increasingly more common since the mid-1990s. These were occasionally encountered along Clear Creek Road in the Clear Creek Valley. in the 90s, but now represent maybe one of the more common nesting warblers along Clear Creek Road and some of the other valleys. Yellow-throated warbler around, usually found in sycamore trees. Black and white warblers, once again, more back farther into the forest and usually in kind of a nice sloped mixed mesophytic. And then the parula is generally regularly scattered around. The yellow-throated and parula a little harder to observe, particularly once they start nesting. When they first come back early in the year, they're early. A lot of times the cooler temperatures put them a lot closer to the ground. But then as they begin nesting, they move up into the treetops and then generally spend the rest of their summer there before migrating out in the fall. I thought about what are 4 things that, what are some species that are in the county probably annually, but are very uncommon. And I picked these 4 species. Veeries, however, if you drive Clear Creek Road between Camp Wyandotte and the Fairfield County line, are fairly common and generally found sitting in the middle of the road, picking up bugs and flying up to a nest site on the adjacent roadway. So if that's a species you're looking for there, there's only a handful of records in the unglaciated portion of Ohio for breeding veeries, but they're very locally common in that stretch of Clear Creek. Henslow sparrows scattered around the area on ridgetop hay fields, ridgetop grasslands. Blue grosbeaks have become more common in years in Hocking, as they have in other portions of the state as well. This is a species that's southern that has really began to range up farther north into Ohio. And summer tanager, they're there. You look at the habitat and you think they ought to be much more common than they are, but a difficult bird to find in the county, but one that you do kind of stumble into and find occasionally. They seem to move around, not being very faithful to any nesting sites on a regular or annual basis. I want to talk about the cerulean warbler very quickly. This is a species that has declined notably, 75% since the mid 60s. Hicks in the mid 30s noted this as 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. I mean, he had cerulean warblers more common than blue jays on his evaluations in the 30s. Recent estimated population in the most recent breeding bird atlas is about 28,000 birds in Ohio. These are, once again, locally common at Clear Creek, some places in the Wayne National Forest, a few places in Tar Hollow State Forest. But this is a species that I hope I showed that picture first off of the Buick's wren. It does concern me that this is a species that in 100 years could be our next Buick's wren, potentially. It has declined over large portions of its range. Treetop nesting bird, this photo that was taken here by Nina Harfman, this nest was about 40 feet off the ground. It just had an opening which she could shoot through the leaves to document the nesting of this species. But really one of our truly prized warblers to try to find, but becoming increasingly rare. A couple of recent additions and confirmations to the breeding birds of our county, prothonotary warblers, which you enjoy quite a bit up along the lake. We find them in some of these old canal areas down here in this part of the state. This was we were able to find a nesting cavity that was very viewable. Actually, I photographed these from a roadway last year as they came in and out of this sycamore nesting hole. A little more surprisingly, is the expansion of the common mergansers. We believe common mergansers have now been nesting in the county since at least 2019. This photo on the bottom left last year was taken by a private landowner on his property and represents the first confirmation of that. And then we're already seeing this year populations that they were present in 2020. Birds have returned to all of those areas. So we are hoping that maybe this bird is becoming a little more established in some of these high quality streams in Hocking County. Species is expanding its range. It seems all along eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and even into West Virginia. Fall migrants, as with spring, we don't see lots and lots of the staging, but we do see many of these things all come through just like they do in northern Ohio, but sometimes a little differently. Our vireos kind of seem to stage here somewhere around that 9th, 10th of September, and then move through. A few years ago in one morning, I saw over 40 vireos, all 6 species. We don't get that down here very often. The very next day, in the exact same location, I counted less than 10 vireos. They moved very quickly. Cape May warblers, you know, they come through, and I like this picture because this bird sat there and hawked that little midge hatch. There were about half a dozen Cape Mays in this spruce tree that morning, flying around chasing midges. These tend to start coming back through, usually for us, between the 15th and 20th of September. Followed very closely by the thrushes that come through as well. A lot of these things are a little harder to see though when they come through. The forest cover being very dense, they don't sing a lot. You got to really know. Let me back up. Sorry about that. You really have to know the call notes and the forest cover to look into. As we get a little later into the fall, we see the later round of warblers include orange crown, Wilsons, yellow rumps beginning to show up. The cuckoos tend to come through, once again, very quiet when they come through. You just see a larger bird in the trees. The sparrows come through in late October. We find swamp sparrows away from cattails and lake edges. We find them in goldenrod fields, and sometimes in fairly reasonable numbers. And so I usually search goldenrod fields for sparrows. Seen Lincoln sparrows, swamp sparrows. Always kind of hoping that maybe we can catch a LeConte sparrow coming through at some point. Winter records. This last year was tremendous, as many of you know. This was the largest finch invasion in 25 years in Ohio. This was the year to see some things. We've had very nice finch numbers in Hocking, but as with everywhere else, very, very sporadic. These red crossbills in '91 were probably about the last red crossbills widely observed in Hocking County. We had a group in nearby Vinton County this past winter that stayed for a week or two, but these birds were coming to a feeder in 1991. Red poles, there are 5 to 6 records of common red poles in Ohio, all are in Hocking County, all at feeders. This was a group that wintered again at a set of feeders back in 2013. They just happened to winter at a home of a guy who's a very, very good photographer. And he's interested in natural history. And he said, I looked out one day, and in amongst the 100 pine siskin were these little birds with red caps on them. And so interesting that we see that. Evening grosbeaks, starting in about 2000, evening grosbeak records became very few and far between in the county. You'd hear maybe an occasional, somebody saw one, heard one fly over, but after 2000, our records really diminished. So in 2019, when a pair showed up at feeder, that was one of the first records we had in Hocking County in a number of years. And then this year, with the invasion of the finches and the evening grosbeaks, we did have some observations early. A lot of them moved on, but a group of about 15 to 20 were at a residence in central Hocking, and we're still there in those numbers. About a week ago, I was there 2 days ago, and there were still about 6 of them present. So they're getting ready to head north. Earlier, we talked about some of the warblers that tend to show up in the winter, or that we have winter records of. This Cape May warbler showed up on Christmas morning at the feeders of Bob and Ann Strait. Bob is a professional photographer. He's got a studio all set up and nice viewing of his soot feeders when he looked out and saw this little yellow bird. This bird stayed there the entire winter, eating almost strictly peanut butter soot for the entire winter. So really just a wonderful record. It's our only winter record of that bird for the county. Shortly after we published our book, a local birder, Jen Allen, discovered a Nelson's sharp-tailed sparrow in the cattails at Lake Logan, and was able to capture this photo that shows the nice gray on the nape and the orange on the face, to start to add a few birds to our to our list for the county. About the only duck that we were really missing from our county list were white-winged scoter. We had records of surf and black scoter. But since 2017 now, we've had 3 records of white-winged scoter. So those birds probably pass through just in very low numbers. And the one in 2019, there were 2 of them that stayed on Lake Logan for 40 minutes. So that's probably how they largely pass through this county. Some of you may know Troy Shively. Troy is the naturalist at Indian Lake State Park in Logan County. Very good birder. And a couple of years ago, while he was at a training at the beach at Lake Logan, he looked out and saw this laughing gull sitting on one of the buoys for our first state record. I'm sorry, county record. And then a couple other recent additions with the expansion of geese populations throughout the entire East. It was kind of a matter of time until we picked up Rosses and cackling geese. And then a little bit of a surprise in 2018 was this neotropic cormorant that spent about 2 weeks at Lake Logan. And with that, I'll just conclude the talk. If you haven't had a chance to get to the southeastern part of the state to bird, there's, you know, kind of after the peak of migration's over and everybody needs to wind down a little bit, it's great opportunity to come down, and there's 100 species of birds that nest in Hocking County every year. Once again, gives you an opportunity to learn the calls and the songs by having a little bit more additional exposure to them. And once again, another writing from Ed Thomas that talked to me. You can kind of see in that obviously his affinity for the hills of southeastern Ohio. And with that, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining today, and we'll answer any questions you might have.
John, thank you so much for all that information. I think we're pretty lucky to have so many great places to bird and appreciate nature in Ohio.
Well, and there's lots of places, you know, it's, you know, not inexpensive, but there's a number of really, really nice cabin rentals and places to stay when you're in Hocking County. To visit. It's really become a major kind of an ecotourism destination in the state of Ohio. So there's plenty of accommodations for people right near where many of these areas are. A lot of those bed and breakfasts and cabins are located near the state park areas and Clear Creek and places of that nature.
Yeah, we make a point to go there once or twice a year, and it's our family's favorite spot to camp. But Clear Creek, we unexpectedly stumbled upon last year, and it's one of our favorite places now. So,
well, kind of unfortunately, a lot of people stumbled into Clear Creek last year because of the state parks all being closed. Clear Creek got on everybody's radar last year, and so that's the park district I used to work for. So I know the manager very well, and he says, yeah, he says last year was a very challenging year for us. He said, I hope it goes back to normal, but he goes, everybody knows where Clear Creek is now.
Yeah, it's definitely a gem. It's a nice place.
It's a wonderful place. They're adding another 3 mile, I think another 3 miles of trail, which will put them to 17 miles of, you know, kind of primitive hiking trails there. So.
Yeah, great place to visit. I hope you all get a chance to go to Hocking Hills, Hocking County. If I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone has a question for John, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask. I have dropped a link in the chat for our Seek Refuge Days programs. There's a few more coming up, and you can catch recordings of any that you may have missed.
Looks like a couple of people have asked if there's any naturalist-led tours. You might check check the Metro Parks, Columbus Metro Parks website. Clear Creek has a part-time naturalist who does lead walks there. There may be a few. I'm not sure what the state parks have. I know the naturalist at Old Man's Cave is a pretty good birder. Has been there a long time. And I believe they probably lead some bird walks there as well. But I do know Columbus Metro Parks does, and you can see those available programs on their website. Obviously, with the COVID the last year, things have been a little different, but I think things are kind of slowly returning back to normal. And so I would, we expect those to probably pick back up as previously here.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask John? You must have answered all the questions in your presentation. Good job.
Oh, thank you.
But I'm going to end this with a quick survey. If you would be so kind to answer a couple questions about our presentation today, you will get a 15% off coupon code for our online nature store. John, we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing everything that you've learned about the birds down there with us.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed doing it. And, all of these things, a lot of them head your way here eventually. So it's kind of interesting that the differences we see. Like I say, we don't see the big staging here, but with some extra time and effort, you can see things come through. I saw a black-throated blue female yesterday. That's a hard bird to see down here. We don't see them in the big staging numbers that you get up north, which are wonderful to see. Some of my favorite warblers. And we see them in 1s and 2s if you're lucky. You got to spend a lot of time out to catch some of these things down here.
Well, it's a beautiful place to spend time to try and find them.
All righty. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Okay. Thank you.
Everybody.